I'm really pleased to be speaking today, and in particular to be closing out this conversation with a topic that I think is really important, which is ethics. In STEM in general, but in particular, I'm going to be talking about computer science. So you can't throw a rock these days without hitting some new tech ethics scandal, whether that is data privacy scandals or accusations of unethical online experiments, or this one is about a week's worth of news about facial recognition systems, or more recently, Cambridge Analytica really dominated the news cycle for quite a while. When I taught my tech ethics class last year, every student had to bring me a news article once a week that was relevant to class. This was not a difficult task, and by the end of the semester, we had about 300 articles about tech ethics with very little overlap. And this one came up a lot. It was shocking for a number of reasons. There was data being gathered by a third party without consent. There was the way that your data can be used for complex inferences, that data scientists could use this to manipulate voting behavior, that they would use it to manipulate voting behavior. And this was a case of not just, oh, Facebook knows I have a dog, so they advertise dog food to me. This was, Facebook knows I have a dog, and they know based on my favorite band and what clothing ads I click on that I'm also an introvert. So they're going to advertise a political candidate with an ad using like someone who lives alone with their dog. And there was a lot of blame that was getting thrown around with this particular situation. And it came down to often, these technologists, they're just so darn unethical. And at the time, there was an op-ed written about the situation compared to ethical reckonings that we've had in the past in other STEM fields, tales of unethical medical experiments on humans, of collapsed bridges. And there was something that was conceptualized here that really struck me, this idea that software engineers treat safety and ethics as specialties rather than the foundation of all design. And when I read this, if I had nodded any harder, my head would have fallen off because I'd been spending a lot of time thinking about a particular phrase that I kept hearing over and over again, which was, I'm just an engineer. So this particular case was a computer scientist who was giving a talk about artificial intelligence that could predict whether a particular crime was a gang-related crime. And when an audience member asked a question about ethics, this was the response. And not long before that, I had listened to a Radiolab interview with a computer science researcher who was involved with creating technology that turned audio into very realistic-looking video. And their prototype used clips from President Obama to make him give a speech that he had not actually given. And when asked about the ethical implications of this technology, the obvious use case for this is fake news, right? Deer in headlights kind of situation. And to be fair, they were kind of caught off guard, but the response was basically, well, I just build things. There are other people who are very well suited to consider the implications and to mitigate harm. In the United States, there is an accreditation body for computer science programs that requires them to have that requires students to have an understanding of social and ethical issues, which of course is quite vague. The most common models for this that I've seen are, we have a day where we talk about ethics in our senior capstone class, or a standalone ethics class that is typically taught towards the end of a degree program. When I was a graduate student at Georgia Tech, I taught one of these classes. It was a very good class. Most students took it at the very end of their degree, usually reluctantly by that point. And by that point, you've spent years learning how to be a computer scientist and the values that are associated with that, like efficiency. And then suddenly, someone's like, oh, here's this thing that really you should have been thinking about all along, we promise. As opposed to it having been a part of whatever they had learned before. And in the early 90s, the National Science Foundation funded a group of people to figure out how to do ethics in computer science education. And they came back and said, you know, standalone ethics classes are good, particularly if that's your only option. It's way better than other things. However, in addition to that, ethics should be integrated across the entire curriculum, and it should be part of every computer science class. And they wrote an article about this in Communications of the ACM, which is the magazine for computer science professionals. And the dean of a computer science department wrote this response in a letter to the editor and basically said that ethics is not doing computer science. How could a computer scientist teach this? You know, there is computer science and it involves things like software development and software design and not thinking about the ethical and social implications of technology. I have been thinking about this particular attitude and this particular problem, and if I could wave a magic wand and change something about the culture of technology, it would be that if you work in tech and you don't think about ethics, you're bad at your job. So this particular phrase that discussing the social and ethical impact of computing is not doing computer science. This is some hot off the presses stuff, but I recently, with the help of some graduate students, conducted a survey at my university of undergraduates and asked them, in part, whether this is true. There was a difference between computer science majors and non-majors. Essentially, the non-majors agreed more with this statement. So the pink here is shades of agreement and the blue is shades of disagreement. Similarly, the non-majors agreed more with the statement that they will have a responsibility to think about ethics in their job. And this isn't comparing like computer science majors and philosophy majors. The biggest group of students in the non-majors were actually advertising majors, so this also like kind of makes me feel better about that. I think that one of the reasons that we are getting this attitude that ethics is a specialization is because that's how we teach it. So there are very complicated potential solutions to a tech ethics crisis, if that's what's happening here. There are even more complicated solutions than just education. But I think that if we are going to change the culture so that ethics is something that everyone thinks about, and not just the ethicists, then we need to change this attitude. So for example, there definitely are specialists. I'm one, so I'm, I guess, a tech ethics specialist. But on a construction site, there are people whose job it is to think about safety engineers. They're the specialists. But that doesn't mean that the person putting up the drywall like walks by a live wire and says, oh, well, that's for the safety engineer to deal with. Maybe they've never even taught to know what a live wire looks like, or that that's something bad that they should be thinking about. So even though there are specialists, it also should be everyone's job and something that everyone is thinking about. And if we're going to do that, we need to change the way that we teach ethics in computer science. And it needs to be integrated throughout everything instead of isolated, which is common right now. So there are a number of benefits to this strategy. One is, as I've been saying, it emphasizes that ethics is part of technical practice and not a specialization or an add-on. And it also avoids isolating ethics from its context. So for example, when you take a machine learning class, you should learn that part of doing this is understanding the potential bias in your training data. Part of doing this is thinking about the potential negative consequences if other people should use your models in ways you don't intend. When you learn how to build databases, you should think about the politics of categories. When you learn how to build user interfaces, you have to understand why it should be accessible and inclusive. These are part of doing the thing. It's not something that you think about later or that you think about only when it's a problem. The other thing that this strategy does is it ensures that everyone who takes any kind of technical class has exposure to these concepts. So I actually was not a computer science major in undergrad. I was a psychology major. And after realizing how much longer it would take me to graduate, I did not double major, but instead just took a bunch of CS classes, which did not include the required ethics class the CS majors took. So I never actually had any exposure in my undergrad to ethical concepts related to computer science, despite having learned a fair amount about how to code. And of course, you don't have to have a bachelor's degree in computer science to do harm with technology. A little bit of code can do a lot of harm. I mean, if you think about back to Cambridge Analytica, arguably the bad actors in that situation, we have a psychologist. The whistleblower was a self-taught data scientist. Mark Zuckerberg dropped out of Harvard. I don't know if he got to a required ethics class. You can do a lot with a little bit of knowledge about computer science, which means that we also need to be thinking about it not just at the university level, but anywhere that people are learning to code. Boot camps, online classes, K-12. Of course, this isn't easy, or everyone would be doing it. There's some challenges to the strategy. These are some that I hear most often when I talk to computing instructors about why they're not including ethics as part of their classes. There's an idea that you don't know enough about it to teach it, which in part is a problem because we're not teaching it now, so how would people know it for later? There's just so much to cover, I can't possibly do more. And there's also the problem that ethics is quite hard to evaluate, particularly when you're teaching 800 undergraduates and have to use an auto grader, right? And there's this perception also that if you don't evaluate it, if it's not on the test, then students won't think that it's important, which is also one of the reasons why I think that it's incredibly important that companies are asking about these issues in job interviews, because that is the ultimate, it being on the test. And if we really want computer science departments to take this more seriously and force more ethics into the curriculum, then the employers who are giving their students jobs are really the ones who are going to have an influence on that. And of course, these kinds of challenges are some reasons why this isn't happening too much. This is a chart from a recently published paper where we analyzed the syllabi from all of the machine learning and data science and AI courses in the top 20 computer science programs in the US. I won't make you read and parse this, but suffice it to say, the answer to this question is no. Ethics is not really being taught as part of these classes. The good news is that there are a number of standalone classes here, like AI and society, but only about 10% or so of the technical classes included any mention of ethics or related concepts like fairness and privacy. So what do we do? I can certainly give you a lot of strategies for teaching ethics in general, because that's what I do. But in thinking about how to integrate it across the entire curriculum and how to do it in sort of small steps, these are some of the things that people have been considering as potential strategies. So one issue is, well, it's an algorithms class, it's a databases class, and it's not relevant, and students don't think it's relevant. Because ethics issues are so prevalent in the news right now, even just bringing them up reminds students that the work that they're doing can have these kinds of results and is what's involved in these kinds of things that are happening. There are a number of initiatives towards creating modules that can be embedded into different classes, often with the help of experts. So at Harvard right now, there is an army of philosophy graduate students and postdocs who work directly with computer science instructors to integrate ethics into their courses, which of course is a very resource-heavy solution, but it results in modules that then other people can pick up and use, and there are a number of people who are working on these things as well and making them open source. Another strategy is to incorporate ethical components into things like projects, and to take existing assignments and recontextualize them, which I'll talk a bit more about in a moment. And then my final suggestion is that this needs to start at the beginning. You don't wait until you get to the really obvious classes. The fact that there's so little of this in machine learning and data science is a little troubling, because those are the obvious ones, right? But the other way that you catch everyone who is learning a little bit of code is to make sure that it's everywhere, which includes, for example, introductory programming classes. From the first line of code you write, you learn that code is power and that it reflects human decisions, that it's not magic and it's not divorced from consequences. So some good news is that there's a lot of work happening in this space right now. So the Responsible Computer Science Challenge, which is run and funded by Mozilla and the Omidyar Network and some other institutions, has funded 18 institutions to be working towards this goal in lots of different ways. So there are people who are working on workshops for faculty, model curriculum, role-playing games, modules, toolkits, real-world interventions, et cetera. And they also represent quite a breadth of different kinds of institutions. So there are, big state schools, Ivy Leagues, community colleges, small liberal arts schools, et cetera. And the hope is that this will result in a lot of things that other people can pick up and use. So I am part of this as well at University of Colorado, and there are two components to what we're doing. One is that we are creating an ethics fellows program for undergraduate students who are enrolled in computing classes, and the idea is that we can embed particularly upper division classes with ethically engaged students who we hope will be inquisitive and also come back to us with ideas for how we can approach instructors about doing more embedded ethics in those classes as well. And the other thing that we're doing is putting ethics into introductory programming classes, which is a little bit of a challenge because these are very overworked instructors. They usually have hundreds and hundreds of students a semester. They rely on auto graders, and it's just a really big undertaking. So for our launch of this fall, one of our priorities was making it as little work for them as possible. And so we decided to take assignments that already exist and to recontextualize them so that they would inherently bring up ethical issues while teaching the same concepts. So there have been a few different examples of this beyond just what we're doing. One of my favorites is from a professor at Bucknell University named Evan Peck, who created some exercises for his intro programming class, and one of them uses self-driving cars and the trolley problem to teach students about algorithmic decision-making and how values are embedded into code. And it is teaching conditionals and iterating through lists, and nothing that you don't do in an intro programming class. Also here on the top right is a little bit of an assignment that actually probably some students at University of Colorado are doing as we speak. So we took an assignment in class that already existed to teach conditionals, that was creating a fortune teller, like tell me if your lifeline is long and I'll give you a fortune. And instead it is serving personalized ads to students. So something between if you have a dog, you get an ad about dog food, to make an inference about the person's amount of wealth based on their zip code, and also whether they're an introvert or an extrovert based on the number of friends that they have. The code is quite simple, it's just conditionals, but it brings up these issues and it tees up conversations about inferences and data, and even like giving them an explanation of Cambridge Analytica. And of course, if we're going to start at the beginning, this also means K-12, and there's been some really excellent initiatives towards this, like this bit of curriculum that comes out of MIT, which is AI ethics for middle school. So again, one of the issues that we have here is that there's this idea that ethics is a specialization, and I think that moving past this attitude is going to be really critical for the future of our tech workforce, which means also that we need to work with tech companies to cultivate this attitude as well. I think that we're starting to realize this a little bit. So we're seeing, for example, all of this, like, oh, we need to care more about the humanities and STEM, etc. One of the things that I think is important about this, I don't actually think, for example, that everyone needs to learn to code. However, I do think that everyone needs enough computational literacy to be able to critique technology, which is an argument for more computational learning in the humanities. We've also talked a little bit about broadening participation, for example. Stereotype threat is a big problem. One of the reasons that girls can drop out of STEM becomes this idea that, being a computer scientist is sitting in a cubicle all day by myself and, typing on the black screens with the green text, and it's not creative and it's not collaborative. And now, of course, we have the problem that we have, all of these scandals constantly, and it makes tech look like it's, potentially the scary, unethical space. And there's also been research that shows that underrepresented groups tend to be motivated by social problems, et cetera. And so emphasizing these things in computer science classes also helps to fight that kind of stereotype threat. I just want to move to a place where ethical considerations becomes part of the technical practice of computing, where if you don't, you've missed a vital step, just as if you haven't been able to debug your code. So I will leave you with this idea from the Responsible Computer Science Challenge, which is that we need to fundamentally reimagine the way that we train tech industry future leaders during their undergraduate years, because I think that if we're going to, one of the things we need to see in the future of work is a workforce where no one is just an engineer. Thank you.